Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. Your answer is already on the way. The breakthrough you've been crying out for is already scheduled in heaven's calendar. But the only thing standing between you and seeing it is whether you stop praying too soon. What if the very next prayer you pray is the one that breaks the dam, shifts the atmosphere, and releases the flood of God's power into your life? Today, I'm here to tell you, don't hang up on heaven before the miracle hits your doorstep. When you pray, you are doing far more than speaking words into the air. You are stepping into a divine transaction with the Almighty. Prayer is the supernatural lifeline that plugs you into heaven's power grid. It is the engine that keeps the movement of God's will advancing in your life. Without prayer, you are trying to fight spiritual battles with earthly weapons, and that will always leave you drained, frustrated, and defeated. But with prayer, you are drawing on the inexhaustible resources of God himself, and that changes everything. Think about it. When you lift your voice to God, you're not just performing a religious exercise. You are entering the throne room of the creator of the universe, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. You're stepping into his presence, and in that moment, you have his undivided attention. The one who hung the stars in place is listening to you. The one who parts seas, calms storms, and raises the dead is leaning in to hear what's on your heart. And when you recognize that reality, prayer stops being a duty and becomes a privilege you would never want to neglect. Now, here's the problem. Too many people treat prayer like a quick pit stop instead of the ongoing fuel for their journey. They toss up a short request, get no immediate response, and then move on as if they've done their part. But if the engine of heaven is going to drive change in your life, you could keep and just give it a quick tap. You have to keep your foot on the gas. You have to keep the connection alive. Prayer is not just about the start. It's about the staying. When Jesus told his disciples to ask, seek, knock, the language he used meant to keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. In other words, don't just pray once and quit. You're not pestering God. You're demonstrating your faith in his power and his promises. Every time you pray, you are reminding heaven and yourself that you believe God is able. And here's the thing. God often moves through people who refuse to let go until they see the breakthrough. Look at the example of Elijah. In 1 Kings 18, after a long drought, God told Elijah he would send rain. Now, if God promised rain, you might think Elijah could just sit back and wait. But that's not what happened. Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel, bowed low to the ground, and began to pray. He sent his servant to look for signs of rain. Nothing. He prayed again, still nothing. He prayed a third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, still nothing. But on the seventh time, the servant saw a small cloud the size of a man's hand. Elijah didn't stop until what God promised began to manifest. That's what happens when you let prayer be the engine. It keeps turning over until the power comes through. And here's what many people miss. Every prayer you pray is doing something, whether you see it or not. In the spiritual realm, your prayers are setting things in motion. Loosening chains, breaking strongholds, opening doors. It may feel like nothing is happening, but behind the scenes, God is rearranging circumstances, shifting people's hearts, and aligning events for his glory. Prayer is like a seed. You may not see anything above ground for a while, but underground, roots are forming, life is taking shape, and in due season, the answer will break through. That's why you can't afford to give up praying just because the situation hasn't changed yet. The enemy would love for you to cut off your own lifeline by quitting too soon. He knows that as long as you keep praying, you're keeping heaven's power engaged in your situation. But the moment you stop, you disengage the flow. If the power is cut, the progress stops. That's why the Apostle Paul told believers to pray without ceasing. It's not about chanting words all day. It's about staying in constant communication with the one who can change everything. Let me put it this way. Imagine you have a direct phone line to the President of the United States, and every time you pick it up, you can make requests that could change laws, open resources, and impact nations. You wouldn't leave that phone sitting idle for days at a time. You'd use it often and boldly because you'd know the authority on the other end. Now magnify that idea infinitely. When you pray, you have the direct line to the King of the universe who holds all power in his hands. Why would you hang up after one short call? Why would you think one brief conversation is enough to draw down all the resources of heaven? Prayer is not a transaction, it's a relationship. And in that relationship, consistency is key. Every prayer you send up builds a spiritual momentum. Like a mighty train, the more you keep feeding it with the coal of faith-filled petitions, the faster it moves and the harder it is to stop. You may start slow and the tracks ahead may look long, but with every word of prayer, you are propelling the movement forward until God's promise comes into view. And remember, prayer is not just about asking, it's about aligning. Every time you pray, you're not only inviting God to act, you're aligning your heart with his purposes. You're saying, God, I trust you to handle this in your way and in your time, but I'm not letting go until you do. That's the kind of prayer God honors. That's the kind of prayer that keeps the engine running full speed. Too many believers let their emotions dictate their prayer life. If they feel encouraged, they pray. If they feel discouraged, they stop. But real faith prays regardless of feelings. Real faith says, I'm going to keep talking to my Father even when it looks like nothing's changing because I know he hears me and he's working. It's persistence that fuels power. It's endurance that draws down the miraculous. So here's the truth. Every single time you pray, you're turning the key in heaven's ignition. And the longer you keep it running, the more momentum builds until the purposes of God begin to surge into your situation. You don't have to have the right words. You just need the right posture. A posture that says, I will not disconnect until heaven invades this circumstance. The power is there. The engine is ready. The only question is, will you keep it running until you see God move? ChatGPT said, when God seems to delay his answer, our human instinct is to assume he's saying no. But a delay from heaven is often a divine not yet. It's not a rejection, it's a preparation. God is never late, but he's also never rushed. He moves according to his perfect timing, which means that sometimes he holds back the visible answer until everything in the unseen realm is aligned for your good and his glory. If you confuse his pause with his refusal, you'll be tempted to stop praying right before the breakthrough arrives. Consider a farmer planting a seed. Once it's in the ground, he doesn't dig it up the next day to check if it's growing. He understands there's a process happening beneath the soil. Roots are developing, cells are multiplying, and the plant is positioning itself for life above the surface. The farmer trusts that the unseen work is just as important as what will eventually be seen. God works the same way in our lives. When you pray and nothing seems to change, he's working beneath the surface, laying a foundation that can support the weight of the blessing when it comes. There are moments when God's silence is his strategy. He's not ignoring you. He's developing you. There are things he needs to prepare in your heart before he releases what you've been asking for. If he gave you the answer too soon, you might mishandle it. If he opened the door prematurely, you might walk into something you're not equipped to handle. His delay is not punishment, it's protection. It's the kindness of a father who would rather withhold a blessing for a season than see his child crushed by it. Sometimes the delay is about aligning the circumstances around you. Think about Joseph in the Bible. God gave him a dream of leadership and influence, but it took years through betrayal, slavery, and prison before he ever saw it fulfilled. Why? Because God wasn't just preparing Joseph, he was also preparing Egypt, positioning Pharaoh and orchestrating a famine that would make Joseph's leadership essential. If Joseph had been elevated to power too soon, he wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time to save nations. Your delay might be the very thing setting up the perfect timing for your destiny. Another reason for delay is spiritual warfare. Daniel experienced this in Daniel 10. He prayed and fasted for understanding, and from the very first day, God sent the answer. But the angel delivering it was delayed for 21 days by a demonic principality until Michael, the archangel, came to help. If Daniel had stopped praying on day 10, he would have missed the answer that was already on its way. Delays are not always about God's reluctance. They can also be about the enemy's resistance. Your persistence in prayer keeps the pressure on the opposition until the answer breaks through. The waiting period is also God's training ground for trust. Faith that only survives in instant gratification is not true faith. It's convenience. Real faith endures when nothing seems to happen because it's anchored not in what it sees, but in who it trusts. Waiting forces you to rely on God's character rather than your timetable. It teaches you that his ways are higher than yours and that his thoughts are far beyond your own. In the process, you develop spiritual endurance, and endurance produces maturity. Think about David. Anointed as king in his youth, he didn't take the throne immediately. Instead, he spent years in the wilderness, running from Saul, hiding in caves, and learning to depend on God for daily survival. That delay was not wasted. It was shaping him into a man after God's own heart. By the time he became king, he wasn't just wearing a crown. He was carrying a depth of wisdom and humility forged in the fire of waiting. When God delays, it's also an opportunity for you to deepen your intimacy with him. If he answered every prayer instantly, you might begin to treat him like a vending machine. Insert requests, receive blessing. But in the waiting, you learn to seek him for who he is, not just for what he can do. You begin to realize that the greatest reward of prayer is not the answer, it's the presence of the one you're praying to. This shift in perspective transforms your relationship with God from transactional to relational, and that is a treasure far greater than any answered request. Delays can also expose motives. When time passes without visible change, your true reasons for praying come to the surface. Are you seeking God's will or just your own comfort? Are you chasing his glory or your personal gain? The refining fire of delay burns away selfish agendas and purifies your desires until what you want aligns with what he wants. That's when your prayers become powerful because they are in harmony with heaven's agenda. We often think we're ready for the blessing, but readiness in God's eyes is more than desire. It's character, capacity, and alignment with his purpose. Picture a child who wants to drive a car. No matter how much the child insists, a loving parent won't hand over the keys until they are mature enough to handle the responsibility. In the same way, God's delay may be his way of making sure that when he gives you what you're asking for, you will handle it with wisdom, stewardship, and humility. And let's not forget, God is always working on multiple levels. You may be focused on one specific request, but he's weaving together countless threads that will all intersect at the right moment. The relationship you prayed for may be connected to the career you didn't expect. The opportunity you've been waiting on may require the growth you're experiencing in another area of life. His delays are often the setup for something far bigger than you imagine. When you understand this, the waiting becomes easier to bear. You stop seeing delay as wasted time and start seeing it as an essential part of the process. You begin to pray with a different posture, not one of frustration, but of expectation. You can say, Lord, I don't see it yet, but I know you're working. I trust that this delay is not a detour, but a direct route to something better than I could ask or imagine. The truth is, you may be closer to your breakthrough than you think. Sometimes the darkest night comes right before the dawn. Sometimes the silence is thickest just before the sound of the answer breaks through. And in that space between the prayer and the fulfillment, your job is not to give up. It's to hold on. Keep praying, keep trusting, keep believing that the God who started the work will finish it, and that his delay is just the prelude to his deliverance. Persistence in prayer is not just about repeating the same words over and over. It's about building a foundation of faith that cannot be shaken. Every time you go back to God about the same matter, you are exercising your spiritual muscles. Just as physical strength grows through repeated use, your faith grows stronger through consistent prayer. That's why God often allows us to wait. As the waiting produces perseverance, and perseverance produces maturity. When you come before God again and again, something begins to shift in you. At first, you may pray simply because you want something to change. But over time, the act of returning to him becomes less about getting the answer and more about staying connected to the one who has the answer. Persistent prayer changes you from the inside out. You start to realize that prayer is not just a means to an end. It's part of the transformation process. Think of it like climbing a mountain. At the base, your goal may be to reach the top. But as you climb, you discover that the journey itself is shaping you, building endurance, teaching you balance, showing you what you're capable of. The summit is still the destination. But by the time you get there, you're a different person than when you started. Persistent prayer works the same way. It develops in you the character, humility, and trust you need to handle the blessing when it arrives. The Bible gives us powerful pictures of this principle. One of the clearest is the story of the persistent widow in Luke 18. She kept coming to an unjust judge, demanding justice against her adversary, Day after day, she showed up. She didn't let his indifference stop her. She didn't let discouragement silence her. Eventually, the judge granted her request, not because he feared God or cared for her, but because he was worn down by her persistence. Jesus told that story to teach his disciples that they should always pray and not give up. If persistence moves the heart of an unjust judge, how much more will it move the heart of a loving father? There's also the example of Jacob in Genesis 32, wrestling with God all night. Jacob refused to let go until he received a blessing. That kind of determination in prayer says, Lord, I'm not quitting until you move in this situation. It's not arrogance, it's faith. It's a declaration that you believe God is not only able to answer, but willing to respond to the cries of his children. Persistent prayer is an expression of trust that God's promises are worth holding on to no matter how long it takes. But persistence is not about wearing God down. It's about wearing your doubt down. Every time you pray over the same matter, you chip away at the fear, anxiety, and unbelief that try to take root in your heart. You replace uncertainty with confidence. You shift from I hope God will to I know God will. By returning to prayer again and again, you reinforce the truth of God's word in your spirit until it becomes unshakable. Persistent prayer also clarifies your desires. Sometimes what you think you want at the beginning of your prayer journey is not what you truly need. Over time, as you keep bringing it before God, your heart aligns more with his will. You may find that your original request changes, not because God refused to answer, but because he reshaped your vision to match his plan. That's one of the hidden gifts of persistence. It refines your prayers until they become kingdom prayers. There's a reason Jesus used the phrase, keep on asking, keep on seeking, keep on knocking. Each action implies continued effort. Asking speaks of communication, making your request known. Seeking speaks of pursuit, actively aligning your life with God's ways. Knocking speaks of opportunity, continuing to approach the door until it opens. Together, they create a picture of relentless faith that refuses to accept defeat. Think about the difference between a single prayer and persistent prayer. A single prayer is like striking a rock once with a hammer. There might be no visible result, but persistent prayer is like striking it over and over, each blow weakening the stone until suddenly it breaks. You never know which prayer will be the one that cracks open the breakthrough, so you keep swinging. In the natural, persistence can be exhausting if it feels like nothing is happening. But in the spiritual, persistence is energizing when you realize that every prayer counts. Even when the results aren't visible, you can trust that something is moving in the unseen. The enemy would love for you to stop because he knows that your breakthrough could be one prayer away. If he can get you to quit, he wins. But if you keep pressing in, he cannot stop what God has set in motion. Another benefit of persistence is that it keeps your spiritual radar tuned in to God's voice. The more you pray, the more sensitive you become to his leading. You start recognizing when he's speaking, even in subtle ways. You pick up on his nudges, his warnings, and his confirmations. This is crucial because often the answer to your prayer doesn't arrive in a dramatic moment. It comes through a series of steps or instructions that you can only follow if you're in tune with him. Persistent prayer also creates a history with God. Every time he answers, no matter how small the request, it becomes a stone of remembrance you can look back on when you face new challenges. You can say, he came through before and he will come through again. This history builds a testimony, not just for you, but for those around you who witness your journey. Your persistence becomes a living sermon that encourages others to keep praying in their own struggles. Sometimes persistence will mean praying for years over the same matter. That's not a sign of failure. It's a sign of faithfulness. There are countless stories of people who prayed for decades for a loved one to come to Christ, only to see the answer near the end of their own lives. They didn't give up because they understood that God's timing is not bound by human deadlines. Your persistence may outlast you, but the fruit will remain. In the end, persistent prayer is about refusing to let go of God's promises, no matter how long the wait. It's about showing up every day with the same request, the same faith, and the same expectation, trusting that the God who hears will act. It's the determination to keep knocking on heaven's door until it swings wide open, not because you think God is reluctant, but because you know he is faithful. It's choosing to believe that every moment spent in prayer is an investment in a future you cannot yet see, but that God has already prepared. When you pray, you are not just speaking into your own life. You are inviting the atmosphere of heaven to invade the reality of earth. Prayer is the bridge between what God has declared and what you are currently experiencing. It's the means by which his perfect will in heaven becomes a visible reality in your situation. When you stop short in prayer, you risk leaving God's promises in the realm of the unseen, never allowing them to break through into the tangible. That's why the call is to keep praying until earth begins to reflect heaven. Jesus taught his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That is not a suggestion, it's a directive. It means you're not just praying for survival, you're praying for transformation. You're asking God to take what is true in heaven, peace, healing, provision, righteousness, and manifest it here and now. But those kinds of shifts don't happen with half-hearted prayers. They happen when believers dig in, stand firm, and refuse to let go until the reality of God's kingdom is evident in their world. Prayer is like drawing a blueprint of heaven's design over the broken structures of earth. You look at the chaos around you, but instead of accepting it as permanent, you hold up God's word and say, this is what it's supposed to look like. Then, through consistent prayer, you keep pressing until the lines match. That persistence is not about convincing God He already wants His will done. It's about resisting the enemy who tries to keep heaven's promises locked away from you. There's a spiritual principle at work here. What you tolerate will remain. If you tolerate lack, fear, brokenness, or defeat without challenging it in prayer, it will stay in place. But when you rise up and say, this is not God's will for my life, and then pray with the determination to see change, you begin to uproot the things that don't belong. You are, in a very real way, enforcing heaven's legal rights on earth. This is why you can't quit halfway. Imagine a well being dug for water. The diggers work day after day, shoveling dirt, breaking rocks, sweating in the heat. If they stop 3 feet before hitting the underground stream, all the effort is wasted. In the same way, many people give up in prayer just before the breakthrough arrives. You may be closer to the answer than you realize, but you'll only see it if you keep pressing until it surfaces. In the Old Testament, we see an example of this in the story of Elijah praying for rain after the drought. He prayed, sent his servant to look, and saw nothing. He prayed again, still nothing. 7 times he prayed, and on the 7th time, a small cloud appeared. That small cloud was all the evidence Elijah needed to know the rain was coming. He prayed until the visible sign matched the invisible promise. That's what it means to pray until earth looks like heaven. You keep going until even the smallest glimpse of God's answer begins to take shape, and then you hold on to it until it's fully realized. Praying until you see God's will done requires a vision of what that will look like. If you don't know what heaven says about your situation, you won't know what you're pressing toward. That's why the word of God is so essential. It shows you heaven's reality. When you're sick, the word says, by his stripes you are healed. When you're anxious, the word says he will keep you in perfect peace. When you're in lack, the word says, my God will supply all your needs. These are not just comforting phrases. They are declarations of heaven's truth. And your prayers are the means by which those truths are pulled into your earthly circumstances. But pulling heaven to earth is not without opposition. The enemy's strategy is to wear you down, to make you think your prayers aren't working, and to tempt you into settling for less than what God has promised. If he can convince you to stop praying, he can delay or even block the manifestation of God's will in your life. That's why persistence in prayer is a form of spiritual warfare. You're not just making requests, you're resisting the forces that oppose God's purposes. When you understand this, you begin to pray differently. You stop approaching prayer as a polite conversation and start treating it like a battle strategy. You speak God's word over the situation. You declare his promises out loud. You call forth what he has already said is yours. You use prayer as both a weapon and a shield, pushing back the darkness while protecting your faith. Praying until earth looks like heaven also requires patience. Sometimes the transformation is immediate. Other times it's gradual. God may work in layers, peeling away obstacles and shifting circumstances one step at a time. You may not see the full picture right away, but you can recognize the signs of progress if you're paying attention. Every small victory, a changed heart, a new opportunity, an unexpected provision, is evidence that heaven is breaking through. Those moments are your encouragement to keep going. You must also be willing to let God move in his way, not just your way. When you're praying for his will to be done, you're acknowledging that his plan is perfect, even if it unfolds differently than you expect. The Israelites prayed for deliverance from Egypt, and God answered, but he did it through plagues, a Red Sea crossing, and a wilderness journey. His way brought total victory, but it also required trust through the process. Praying until earth looks like heaven means trusting God enough to let him write the story while you keep turning the pages in prayer. Sometimes the most powerful prayers are the simplest. Lord, let it be on earth as it is in heaven. That one request covers every area of life, your family, your health, your finances, your community. But the power of that prayer isn't in saying it once, it's in saying it until you see it. And when you finally do see it, you realize that every moment you spent on your knees was part of the miracle. The truth is, God's will is not a fragile thing. It doesn't break under pressure, and it doesn't expire with time. But for it to be fully realized in your life, it often requires your persistent agreement. Prayer is the way you come into that agreement over and over again until the reality around you is transformed to match the reality of heaven. And when that happens, the world around you sees a living testimony of what it looks like when God's kingdom comes and his will is done right here, right now.